Dio was a kind-hearted 100-year-old man. He loved doing good deeds, and the number of good deeds he had done over the years was countless. Despite his many kind actions, this respected elderly man met a tragic end. He was beaten to death on the streets of Cairo by a 17-year-old bully. How did this happen? Let's take a closer look. At over 100 years old, Dio lived alone in a dilapidated house in Cairo. His health wasn't great, so he spent most of his time at home, rarely going out. Often, he would just sit on his bed and read books to pass the time. One day, Dio suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness and decided to take a walk on the bustling streets. He also wanted to buy some small bread. Having lived a simple life his entire life, he couldn't resist the temptation to touch a luxury car parked by the side of the road. Little did Dio know, his simple act of curiosity would be seen by the car's owner, Jotaro. Jotaro was a notorious local bully, just 17 years old, but already famous for regularly beating adults and dining without paying. These were his usual habits. Dio never expected that such a minor gesture would provoke Jotaro, who swore to teach him a lesson. Jotaro immediately approached Dio. Dio, frightened, quickly explained that he had just been curious and begged Jotaro not to come any closer. But Jotaro had no intention of letting Dio go. He even mocked that if he didn't get closer, how could he beat Dio properly? Before Dio could react, a fist wrapped in destructive power, accompanied by a loud whoosh, slammed into his weathered face, sending the elderly man flying. At over 100 years old, Dio's body wasn't as strong as it once was. The punch from Jotaro knocked the wind out of him, and he had no strength left to stand. If he had not neglected to exercise when he was younger, perhaps he could have withstood the punch. But now, at his age, he was helpless. Yet, Jotaro wasn't satisfied. He poured a bucket of gasoline over Dio and prepared to burn him alive. Just then, a police car drove by. The poor Dio, in his weakened state, managed to grab hold of the car and drag his frail body to escape. But Jotaro, the ruthless bully, was undeterred. He dared to attack the police car without fear of consequences. In the end, Dio, forced into a corner, scurried into a nearby sewer like a rat to escape. However, the demon that should have been behind him was already waiting below the manhole cover.
And where do you think you're going? We've got unfinished business.
Suddenly, a flurry of fists rained down like a storm. Dio was knocked up into the air again before crashing heavily onto the ground. Helpless, Dio realized there was no way out. He had no choice but to beg for mercy from such a powerful force of evil. Kneeling on the ground, he bowed to Jotaro and even offered his only remaining possessions, hoping for a chance to survive. But Jotaro continued to beat him mercilessly. Dio was beaten to death in this cruel, senseless way. He couldn't understand why a simple act of touching a luxury car had led to such a tragic end. It was only much later that the police finally arrived and subdued Jotaro. Doctors rushed to save Dio's life, but it was too late. Dio couldn't be revived. From that moment on, Cairo would no longer see the kind face of the 100-year-old Dio. The world is so indifferent, and the human heart is so hard to predict. Dio's tragic fate, doesn't it make us reflect deeply and feel compassion?